Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's special exclusive episode. We are delighted to be joined by Middle Eastern correspondent Jotam Confino, who will give us the lowdown on the recent developments in Israel. Let's jump straight into it then. Jotam, please give our listeners a rundown of what has been happening in the past few days in Israel.
Yes, so on Monday, the Israeli government passed the first of its judicial reforms. It's a law that's called the Reasonableness Law. And what it does is that it prevents the Supreme Court from striking down government decisions in the future. So for the government, this is a way to improve Israel's democracy. It argues that the Supreme Court has too much power, that it can strike down decisions if they aren't reasonable. For the government, it's simply too far reaching. It's a court that has too much power. Now, for those who oppose it, and I will have to stress here that it's a majority of Israelis who oppose this reform, as well as some of the other reforms. And I'm saying that because all polls that have been conducted in the past 6 months, they show the same results. Majority of Israelis oppose this. For them, this is an attack on Israel's democracy. It's an attack on the Supreme Court. And for them, it is a way for the government to appoint corrupted ministers, for example. And the reason why I'm mentioning this also as an example is because it is the most recent example of when the court used the reasonableness clause in Israel to strike down a decision by the government. It happened in January. It was when Prime Minister Netanyahu appointed the ultra-Orthodox party leader Aryeh Deri as Interior and Health Minister. And the Supreme Court said that decision is unreasonable in the extreme because Aryeh Deri is a 3-time convict. He has been in jail on tax fraud. And if we go back just 1 year, he made a plea deal with the Supreme Court, again over tax offenses, and he promised the court to leave political life. A year later, he didn't uphold that promise. In fact, he wanted to be a minister again. So that is one very specific and recent example of when the court has used the reasonableness clause to strike down a government decision.
Thank you so much. I think if we rewind to March, when we had the last special episode on Israel, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant spoke out against the coalition's plans, urging the government to pause the reforms. And Netanyahu then announced that he was dismissing Gallant, but that actually didn't happen. Moreover, in March, we also saw a general strike happening. Yotam, tell us what's different this time. Why did Gallant not call for another pause? Why did we not see another general strike, for example, from Israel's National Trade Union?
It's a very good question. I think what's happening right now in Israel is groundbreaking. We did see the Israeli Medical Association announce a 24-hour strike the day after the reform was passed. So doctors went on a strike, which is huge. It's a huge decision. It has a huge impact on Israel's medical system. As far as the workers' union goes, they haven't announced any general strikes yet, but we simply don't know what will happen in the coming days, even, or weeks, or months for that matter. But it could be that we will see unions striking. As of now, they are not. I think what's more serious really is the fact that over 10,000 Israeli soldiers in the IDF reserve have announced that they will no longer show up for duty. Now that is the biggest consequence, the biggest fallout of this judicial reform. It has a huge impact on the Israeli army and its capabilities. And it's not just me saying that, that's the IDF chief saying that. So lots of consequences and more to come, for sure more to come.
In terms of consequences and what's to come, there are many ideas circulating what's going to happen next. And I wonder, how do you see this situation evolving going forward? Will the Supreme Court reject the law? Do you see a constitutional convention of a viable outcome? Or Will the next elements of the overhaul be met with consensus and compromise? What's next?
So this is, of course, the million-dollar question. What happens next? We can say a few things that we know for a fact. So in September, the Supreme Court will hear a petition against this new judicial reform. Now, whether they're going to strike down this law or not, that's pretty much impossible to say. And I'm saying that because a lot of experts have spoken out against this and given their thoughts on it. And they're quite divided, actually. Some say that the Supreme Court could strike it down. They could say that it's a political abuse of power by the government and that it's not in the public's interest and that it runs counter to the Jewish state's values to weaken the Supreme Court and all that. Some argue that they can. It would be quite unprecedented, and it would be a declaration of war from the Supreme Court against the government if it does that. And it would be a huge constitutional crisis, because who do you listen to? Do you listen to the government that's democratically elected, or do you listen to the Supreme Court? That is a massive crisis. If they don't, which some argue that they can't, simply because that would be unconstitutional, they don't have the powers to strike down this kind of law, then it will be enacted, and then we will see the government trying to pass some of the other laws. We have to remember, what was passed on Monday is just one of many reforms that the government would like to pass. There is another law that would basically change the structure of the committee that appoints Supreme Court judges. The government would very much like to have a majority of the people sitting in the committee being represented by the government. In other words, the government would like to appoint Supreme Court judges, which would politicization of the Supreme Court. So that's one thing that we're looking at now that could come next. But we have to remember that the Knesset is now on recess, on a summer holiday. They'll come back in a couple of months and then they'll start working again. And this is one of the laws that we'll probably have to deal with next. Now, Netanyahu says he would like to find a consensus with the opposition. I think that few people believe him at this point, simply because he went ahead and passed such a controversial law without consensus. He could have waited. There's no rush when you're changing a democratic system, when you're changing the entire judicial system. And lastly, we'll see more protests. I think that's really important to remember, that the hundreds of thousands of people that have taken to the streets on a weekly basis for 6 months, they are not going to back down. They're not going to just give up and go home. In fact, they're saying we're going to intensify the protests. So we're going to see different things, protests, the government trying to pass new laws, and of course, we will probably also see more violence on the streets. And again, I'm saying this because the past week, we've seen a spike in violence against demonstrators, particularly, both from police, but also from right-wing activists. And this is probably one of the more serious things, because this is what could throw Israel into a civil war situation.
Thank you so much. About the wider context, I'd like to ask the security situation in Israel. We are talking at a time not long after a major Israeli operation in Jenin and reported terror attacks against Israelis. How do you assess the current security situation in Israel, especially at a time when the PA's legitimacy and presence in the West Bank seems particularly weak?
It is a very, very bad time for Israel security-wise. The borders are unstable. Both the Gaza border is very unstable. We've seen rockets fired from Gaza numerous times the past 6 months, in fact, the past couple of years. And the Palestinian conflict isn't going anywhere. In fact, it's just continuing to unravel. Almost on a daily basis, we see clashes between Israeli soldiers and Palestinians in the West Bank. This week, we've seen several killed. And on the northern front, the border with Lebanon, we see Hezbollah constantly making provocative actions. They are patrolling near the border. They're flaunting their power. They're telling Israel, we're watching you. We see that you're weak, and you should be careful. And Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's leader, is saying Israel is about to commit suicide, more or less. and that it's just a matter of years really before there won't be an Israeli state. So Israel is facing a lot of security challenges internally, terror attacks, the West Bank, Gaza, but also on the northern front. And we also have to remember Iran, as just to add to the mixture. Iran's nuclear program is also unraveling rapidly, and that's something that's a threat to Israel. It really is. So it's a really, really bad situation security-wise, and that's why it's so important that there's cohesion in the army, that you don't have tens of thousands of soldiers refusing to serve. Now, I'm not saying whether they should or not. That's not up to me. I'm just saying that it's really, really bad when you have elite soldiers, pilots, people in the intelligence departments in the IDF refusing to show up for duty. That is something that will affect Israel's security. That's just a fact.
Thank you very much for your time, Jotam.
My pleasure.